7:17 p.m. on the afternoon of July 20, 1969, the hatch of the lunar module Eagle opened. Millions of people worldwide watched as astronaut Neil Armstrong descended a ladder attached to the spaceship and then became the first man ever to set foot on the surface of the moon. That occasion was punctuated by Armstrong's famous statement,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
"It is unlikely that any of us will ever set foot on the moon. Yet every day we take steps that may be of even greater significance. While they are typically small steps, they have in them the potential to change the trajectory of our lives, our future, and our faith. Small steps that may be in fact giant leaps."
Going into space, I think on one hand sounds incredibly exhilarating, doesn't it? To think about it, to feel the thrust of 7.8 million pounds of thrust as you're launched into space. You reach speeds of 100 miles an hour, 8 seconds into your journey. Your rocket hasn't even cleared the launch tower yet. You hurtle through space at speeds of 18,000 miles an hour. That's 9 times faster than the average rifle bullet. You look out the window, you see the Earth as a little marble there. You feel what it's like to be weightless. You go places that few, if any, people have ever gone before, including Neil Armstrong, who was the first to take a step on the moon. And it sounds exhilarating on one hand, and maybe a little scary and intimidating on the other hand, when you start to think of what could go wrong. And we've certainly had our failures and our catastrophes in our space program. Think back to 1986 when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded on takeoff. You can fast forward several years to 2003 when the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated, returning to Earth. And so you would think those stories might be what's going through astronaut Mike Massimino's mind as he prepares to launch on the Space Shuttle into space on the Atlantis to do some work on the Hubble Space Telegraph. Will I be safe? Will I make it back to my family? Will I live through this experience? Those are the fears you would expect him to be dealing with, and yet they really weren't. He was actually dealing with a different fear. He was dealing with the fear of whether or not he was going to be successful in his task. He was being launched on the last and final, the 5th, space shuttle to the Hubble Space Telescope. And if he messed this up, it would be in some ways the end of what the Hubble could do as far as in one very specific area here. Now, if you're familiar with this, with the Hubble, it was about the size of a school bus. It was launched back in 1990. It was budgeted to cost $575 million. By the time they got it into orbit, it actually had cost $1.8 billion. They got it up there and discovered that it didn't work. And you might remember this in the news. Here's what had happened. There's an 8-foot lens in the Hubble, and it had been ground incorrectly. It was 2.2 micrometers off. And if you want to know how much that is, it's less than the width of a human hair. And because of that, the telescope could not focus, and it was considered a bust, except for the fact we were able to send a space shuttle to the Hubble, and they actually fixed it with, in a sense, a pair of glasses that actually repaired that. And that became one of several flights that went actually up to the Hubble to fix that. And the first 3, they worked within the Hubble, and then the last 2 flights, including the one that we're talking about this morning, were actually involved spacewalks where they were working on the Hubble. The last flight that was taken here to the Hubble, the spacewalk guy was this Mike Massimino. And he had the responsibility of replacing a power board that had gone bad. Now, when they originally sent the Hubble into space, they expected it to only last so long, and then they just let it go. Well, with the advance of technology, they realized that if they could replace some parts on it, they could keep the Hubble working. And so they sent this crew up to fix these parts. The problem was that they never intended for these parts to be fixed. And so getting to them was pretty hard. Usually when they sent up the shuttle, they just pull out one component and put in a new component, but this couldn't happen that way without going through all kinds of steps. And so they had to pull 4 screws out to get to one part, and then there was a handle there that was attached by 4 screws. It was in the way. It had to come off. And then they got to a plate that was held on, are you ready for this? 111 screws. And then once they got that off, they were going to have to pull this power board out, which had 120 different prongs that couldn't be bent or anything, pulling that out, putting a new one in. Well, Mike Massimino was tasked with this responsibility. And so he was going up as a single man to do a repair that nobody thought could be done on a piece of equipment that cost over $1 billion. And he was a little bit spooked. Well, he gets out there, and everything starts out well. He gets out there for a spacewalk. The first 4 screws come out. He gets to the handle. He takes out screw number 1, screw number 2, screw number 3. They had done this hundreds of times in a simulation. He gets to screw number 4, and the head of the screw strips out. He said the problem is the nearest hardware store is not very close. And so they had never had this problem in any of their simulations. And so they were a little bit befuddled what to do, and they're talking back to Houston, and Houston's giving them different ideas, and he keeps going back and forth to the payload and trying to get different tools, and everything just keeps making it worse. And he said, there I was in space, realizing that I was about to become the biggest failure the world had ever seen. I had been set up, I had trained 14 years for this, the crowning moment of my career to fix this piece, and I couldn't get the screw out. Well, finally, Houston said, we only have one other thing to suggest here. Why don't you try to rip the handle off? Do you think you can do it? He's like, I'll give it a shot. And sure enough, he pulled down it, ripped that handle, and it broke off in his hands, and nothing at all ripped on the telescope, and he was able to go in, pull out all those 111 screws, keep them all straight, replace that power board, put everything back together. And it's 30 years since we put the Hubble up into space, and it is still operating today and sending back pictures. You can go to NASA's website and even look at some of the pictures that are coming back there. But there are moments in life when we're called upon to do something hard. There are moments in life when we're called upon to do what's almost impossible, to do something maybe that nobody's done before, or nobody's had to do it quite like us, and it can be hard, or sometimes it can be frightening, or intimidating, or even critical, like everybody is depending upon us. And those are faith moments. We have the choice where we're can step back and shrink back, or we can step into the moment and step into uncertainty and take small steps that hopefully will become giant leaps. But have you ever dealt with the feeling of fear or anxiety, or maybe you've been overwhelmed or apprehensive or intimidated at something that you need to do in your story? Some step that you need to take, but you're not quite sure how it's going to come out, and it's looming large and huge over you. Well, you're not alone. Now, sometimes we say, well, hey, we have these promises of God that are going to help us in our situations. I don't know about you, but I've noticed that a lot of promises seem to be kind of vague. Like, I read the promise, God says, I'll always be with you. And I'm thinking, like, I wish it said, I will be with you when you talk to the boss, and he's going to be okay with what you propose here. It never comes out quite that specific. And so we actually step into some level of uncertainty when we take faith steps. And that's the whole idea. We don't really know how it's going to turn out. If we're launched into space, we don't really know if it's going to be successful. But if we walk in and talk to the boss, we don't really know if it's going to be successful. If we try this, or we say this, or we go here, or we agree to do this, we don't really know how it's going to turn out. And our minds go to all the people or all the times in our lives where we have tried it and it hasn't turned out so well, and we're like, I don't know about that. But most of us face times in our lives when we have big issues in front of us that loom large, that block out the sun, that fill us with foreboding. They are huge and they're intimidating, and they stand in our path. Much like Goliath did one day when he stood on a hillside and he challenged the army of Israel and said, hey, send somebody out to fight me, and nobody stood up to the challenge. And all of us face similar situations in our lives when giants stand on the hillside of our lives and say, come on, bring it on, big boy, let's see what you got. And we're like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I have enough to handle this situation. And this could be any situation in your life. And that's what I'd encourage you this morning, is to think through, what is that giant that you're dealing with right now? That thing that you're like, nah, I don't think I can handle that. I don't think I can solve that. That seems impossible. It could be a financial hardship. It could be a past abuse that still plagues you. Maybe it gives you literal nightmares. Maybe it's a rejection that you faced and you don't know what to do with it. Maybe it's a situation at work that you need to address. And you know that if you step into that, it could get ugly. It could turn out not like you want it to. Maybe it's just a goal or a dream or desire that you have out there, but so far you've done nothing about it because, I couldn't do that. It's too big for me. Maybe it's something like depression, an ongoing struggle with something emotional, or a health issue. Maybe you're in danger right now, and you're very aware of the fact that there's somebody out there who really does want to do you harm. Maybe it's a secret habit you have. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's even just a step of faith that you look at, something like baptism, where you're like, you know what, I'm terrified of water. Or you're like, I'd be humiliated standing in front of people there and so nervous about that. You could go in any direction, but what I want you to do this morning is I want you to stop and say, okay, what is my giant? What is it that I'm facing right now that has me overwhelmed, that has me intimidated, that I'm just like, don't see how that's going to work. And actually maybe it's something that just is constantly on your mind. It could be a class that's hard. It could be loneliness that you're facing. It could be a test that you have to pass. I don't know what it is. But what's your giant in your story right now? What's that big thing that has you anxious, dismayed, or even defeated? We call those things giants. In partly because we see a story like David and Goliath here, and we relate to their story, and we see our obstacle in our situation much like David, or maybe not so much David, but the Israelites saw Goliath that day. So if you would, turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we're going to read this story. And there's quite a bit of backstory that goes to it. We're going to actually jump into the story at verse number 20. But 1 Samuel 17, verse number 20, it says this: early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of the shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. Jesse was his father, and he was sending David out to see his brothers who were in the military, the army of Israel. They were facing the Philistines. And David was taking some provisions probably to his brother and most likely checking to see how the war was going. Well, David reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines and facing each other, and they were opposite sides of a valley with a creek or river running through the middle of it. But David left the things that he had with the keeper of the supplies, and he ran to the battle lines and asked his brothers how they were. And notice that word ran there. It's going to show up 3 times in this story. David ran. And as he was talking to his brothers, verse 23, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. Usual defiance. And David heard it. When the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. They were intimidated. Now the Israelites have been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? And he had been coming out twice a day for 40 days and issuing this challenge. And the challenge was, you send one man out to fight me, winner take all. If I beat him, Philistines win. If he beats me, the Israelites win. But no takers on the Israelite side. Well, verse number 26, David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God? And they repeated to him what they'd been told, and this is what's going to be done for the guy who kills him. And there are several rewards out there that Saul, who was the king and the general of the army there, had promised. But when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger and asked him, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness?" And you can hear the drip of sarcasm there. David's arrived, and he's like, "Well, who's this big guy making all this noise here? And what's going to be done for the guy who wins against him?" And his brother's like, "Oh, gosh, David, do you have to embarrass me? What are you doing here, David? Where did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness there?" And he's doing his best to really minimize and marginalize David. And David in verse number 29 says, "What have I done? Can't I even speak?" And it's like he's saying, hey, and he's rolling his eyes and saying, "Hey, Eliab, am I allowed to say anything here, buddy?" And he turns and he talks to somebody else. And he brings up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. And so he's taking some small steps here, actually. He's assessing the situation. He's getting some information, and now he's taking the small steps of actually going to Saul to talk to Saul. And he gets to Saul in verse 32, and he says, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." And Saul looked at him and laughed him off and said, "You're not able to go out and fight this Philistine. You're only a young man." And he's been a warrior from his youth. Now, Saul's making some assumptions here. He's making the assumption that David's really underqualified and not capable of taking out this giant. And he's also making the assumption, I think, that Goliath was this great warrior. But I don't know how he knew that. We have no record that Goliath had ever won anything. So there's some assumptions being made, and David goes ahead and says this: "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep." And I love this, how he takes the line that Eliab had turned against him, and he turns it for him and says, "Yeah, you know what? I've been out keeping sheep. However, that's been my training ground, because as I've kept sheep, when a lion or a bear came out and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth, and when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and I killed it. So yeah, I've been watching sheep, but I've been killing bears and I've been killing lions too, with my bare hands, okay, guys?" I love it. And Saul's like, "Well, okay. Let's see what happens here." And he says in verse number 37, "Go and the Lord be with you." So then Saul dressed David in his own tunic, his own armor, and put a bronze helmet on his head. And David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around. But he was not used to them. He said, "I can't go out in these. I'm not used to these." So he took them off. Instead, he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. And so he's been taking small steps. What's going on here? What's going to happen? Let's go talk to Saul. Let's get permission to go into battle here. And now he's going off, and the next thing he's doing is grabbing some stones that he's going to use with the sling, which is going to be the only weapon that he takes into battle there. And he goes on into battle. Goliath meets him, says, "Am I a dog," verse number 43, "that you come after me with sticks?" And he cursed David by his gods. He says, "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and to the wild animals." And I think this is an interesting exchange, and don't miss this. David's running into battle. Goliath standing there, sees him coming. Should have just picked up his spear and chucked it, right? But he doesn't. He says, "Who are you? What's going on here?" And he wants to engage David in conversation. Really? Why? I think because he was trying to size up the challenge to make sure that he was still big enough for the little guy that was coming at him. And this is how it is with intimidating things. They make a lot of noise. And this is how it is, sometimes we find people who are bullies in life. They make a lot of noise, and then all of a sudden somebody stands up to them, and they're not quite sure what to do with it. And I think that's what's going on in Goliath's world. He'd thrown out a lot of threats, but he'd never had to put up before. And so David arrives there in verse number 45, says, "You come at me with a spear and a sword and a javelin. I come at you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I will strike you down, and I will cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there's a God in Israel, And all those who are gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. And as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. So now we're leaving behind small steps. We're getting into giant leaps. And he takes a stone from his bag, puts it in a sling, throws it at the giant, hits him in the head. He falls face down. Verse number 15. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and he killed him. It's a familiar story, but what a great story. And I think it's an encouragement to us this morning. For all of us who have faith steps that we need to take in our lives because we're facing giants in our stories. And so what I'd like to do here this morning is I'd like to make some observations from this story that really are actually small steps. And each one of these is a small step that we can take when we face off with our giants that will ultimately lead us to a giant leap. Here's the first one. Just say no to the status quo. David gets here, he looks around at the situation and says, this is what you guys have been doing for 40 days? You come out, you all get dressed up and act like you're going to go fight, and this giant comes out and he issues this challenge, and you all turn around and run? He's like, you got to be kidding me. This is like one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. But in our stories, we often do the same thing. We have this issue in our life that's overwhelming us or intimidating us, and we come out and we're like, gosh, I don't know what to do about that. And we go through a whole day, and we go back to bed, and we get up the next day, and we come out, and that problem's still there, that giant's still there, and I was like, I don't know what to do about this. And what we end up doing is nothing. And we choose what is instead of what could be. And in our stories, we need to choose what could be and keep pursuing that and not be satisfied with what is. But we have a tendency to choose the familiar over the uncertain. And we choose the familiar because we think it gives us security, because we think we can predict it. But that's not true, is it? You have all kinds of stories in your life where something happened on one day that changed the direction of your life. And so sometimes we're like, well, I'm just going to sit this one out because that's going to be safe. You have no idea if that's going to be true. There's no guarantees. And actually, what happens then is we choose certain defeat over possible victory. You know what's crazy? Is most of our losses in life are from battles that we never fought. Most of our losses in life are from battles that we've never fought. Where if we just fought them, we might have discovered that we would win. And it wasn't that David was so awesome in this story, was it? It was that God was awesome. And any other person in that Israelite camp could have gone into battle with Goliath, with God at his side, behind him, protecting him, leading the way, whatever, and won that victory. But they accepted what is. And so I would say this, whatever the situation that you find yourself in this morning, have you decided that it's unwinnable? Or have you come to the place, and hopefully maybe even this morning you say, you know what? The status quo is no longer effective. I'm going to stop accepting what I should not accept, and I'm going to start doing at least something, because doing nothing is worthless. Secondly, refuse to be intimidated. Refuse to be intimidated. We experience intimidation when what we are facing seems to be bigger than who we are or what we think we're capable of. So let me say it again. We feel intimidation when whatever it is that we're facing seems bigger than what I bring to the story. But here's the deal with intimidation. Intimidation works on the basis of threats, not of promises. Goliath only threatened. Goliath never delivered on what he threatened. Intimidation is based on perception, what we think might happen, not on reality of what actually will happen. It's based on predictions. This is where I think it's going. It's not based on any certainty. And so we get intimidated when we stand before an issue, but it's just our prediction of what we think is going to happen. And we have no idea. And it's not the giant, or it's not the enemy that's actually doing this to us. It's us doing it to ourselves because of what we are projecting onto the situation. And so we need to stop seeing our giant as unbeatable because we have the potential to win. And that means that we're going to have to do this. We're going to have to listen to the voice of truth and shut out the voices of falsehood. Think about all the messages that David was hearing in this story. He was hearing his brother say, oh, you're cocky. He's hearing his brother say, oh, you're just a shepherd. He's hearing both his brother and Saul say, you know, you're not able here. He's hearing Saul say, well, you're just a boy. He gets there before Goliath, and Goliath says, I'll feed your flesh to the beast. This is a joke. All of these messages that David's hearing, and all of them are false. They all seem reasonable. They all seem logical, but they are all false messages. David instead chooses to believe a different message. And the message is what? The message is that God can do this. And sometimes we listen to the wrong messages in our stories. We listen to what other people are saying, or even worse, we listen to what we tell ourselves. I don't think I could do that. You know, I've tried that before and I failed. You know, other people have, you know, tried that and they haven't been very successful. Or, you know what, I kind of got into this now, I wish I had. And we tell ourselves all kinds of things in our mind, and they're not true. And we need to shut out falsehood, and we need to listen to truth. And the truth is what? We've read it. We've sung about it today. The truth is that the battle is the Lord's. You get intimidated because you think I have to be big enough for this. And we get intimidated because we look at our resources as us. David had a different perspective. He says, you know what? I'm not intimidated because, have you seen how big God is? I think this is a really interesting, just an aside in this story too. This whole story is about the height of Goliath. He's 9'9". It's pretty big. David, we don't know how tall he is. Other than the fact that when Samuel anoints him to be king, he says, what? Don't look on his height. It's not a big deal. And then this big story where David really comes to the limelight. What is it? It's a height story that comes out here. But David's like, it doesn't really matter how big I am. It doesn't really matter if I can. What matters is if God can, because this is how big God is. Focus on how big God is. Now, at the beginning of the message, I mentioned the Hubble Space Telescope. These are some images that have been taken by this telescope. Just for fun this morning, let's just go ahead and count these stars, okay? You ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. It's impossible. There are billions and billions and billions of stars in our Milky Way, which is just one of billions of galaxies out there. Who created this? God. Okay? Some more pictures. Some more stars. Crazy, isn't it? This is what Mike Massimino was trying to save for us, too. These are actual pictures taken from this telescope. Crazy, isn't it? Who created all that? Who's bigger than all that? Who's out there beyond all that? And we look at something like that, and you can pick one of those stars, and it'll be bigger than the sun that our planets revolve around. The sun is a pretty insignificant star in the overall picture of things. And then you see this little tiny planet, and on this little tiny planet, there's this little tiny guy named Goliath. When you look at the big picture here. How about this verse right here? Oh, another picture. Incredible, isn't it? That we have a God who's this big. How big is Goliath? You got to be kidding me. But this is what God says here in Isaiah. To whom will you compare me? Who is my equal, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all of these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them name by name. Are you kidding me? Because of his great power and his mighty strength, not one of them is missing. I don't know what your problem is in life. I'm pretty sure, though, that God's bigger than it is. Incredibly bigger than it is. And we have this amazing God who goes into battle with us and for us, behind us, in front of us. And so we have all these steps that we can follow, which leads us finally to this big step. We need to run towards the chaos. David could have been in the same boat as Goliath, said, hey, you can't mess with me because I got God on my side. And stood there, and nothing happens. But David picks up 5 stones, and he runs into battle. He runs towards the chaos, not away from it. We mentioned before that David was a runner in this story, but David approached things with expectation. David approached this situation with enthusiasm. And our attitude at the start is likely to affect our outcome at the end. And when we face giants in our lives, the attitude that we start with is likely to affect the outcome of our story. And we need to run into the chaos to see what happens. I like what's been said often, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog. And when we're facing our giants, we need to have a lot of fight in the dog there. Next thing here, take advantage of your advantages. Remember, height doesn't really matter. In fact, Malcolm Gladwell, who's just a secular author, wrote a book, and he uses this story as an example of how sometimes we look at things and say, this is a disadvantage that might actually be an advantage. And he suggests that maybe David's height was an advantage to him. And the fact that David wasn't wearing all this armor was an advantage to him too, because he could move very easily. Goliath's wearing 200 pounds of armor. It's a little hard to be mobile. And David was using a sling and a stone. They say that a stone from a sling can have the same power or the same stopping power equivalent to a bullet from a .45 caliber pistol. David was armed, buddy, with an advantage that Goliath didn't have. And his size may have been to his advantage. The fact that he was not wearing all this armor was to an advantage. He was battle tested also. I don't know if Goliath had any lions and bears on his resume or not. David did. But there are advantages in your story, experiences that you've had, lessons that you've learned, maybe skills that you've developed. You have advantages that will help you win in the fight against your Goliath. Find them and use them. And then finally here, fight to the end. Take no prisoners. David, why did he pick up 5 stones? There's a lot of speculation out there. I'll give you my opinion. He picked up 5 stones because he was expecting it to be a fight, and he'd probably have to use more than one. And maybe he was a little bit surprised when the first one knocked the giant down. He's like, whoa, guess I didn't need those 4. But I think that's why he took them, because he intended to win at the beginning. And if we're going to go into the fight and if we're going to go after a giant in our lives, we have to intend to win from the start. Pick up all 5 stones. Don't say, well, let's just see how this goes. I hope this works out okay. You can't be that way. You have to go over it. And you never know. You might drop your giant with just 1 stone. So what is it, the giant that you're facing? Maybe it's sharing your faith. Maybe it's, you know what? I really feel like the faith step I need to make, this giant I'm facing, is just, trusting God with my finances. Or maybe it's trusting God with my time. Maybe it's prayer. And it's like, that's just a giant in my life. It's something I know I need to do, and I just haven't been very good at it. Maybe it's just an internal issue that you're dealing with. Maybe it's something like bitterness. Or maybe it's anxiety and worry. Maybe it's discipline. Maybe it's lust. There's so many giants that we have in our story, but what is your story? Whatever your story is, it's going to require you to take a step. Just a small step. Maybe your small step is saying no to the status quo. Maybe your small step is stepping back and evaluating why you feel so intimidated. Maybe your small step is just simply listening to a different voice. Maybe your small step is remembering how big God is. Maybe your small step isn't that small. Maybe it needs to be a big step in running towards the chaos and adjusting your attitude. Maybe it's taking advantage of some gift that you already have in your possession. Maybe you just need to keep on fighting. But what steps do you need to take? Small steps lead to giant leaps. you know why most giants win? Most giants win because nobody tries to take them down. Because my guess is if somebody had tried to take down Goliath before, they might have succeeded, especially if it had been in Israel who was trusting God. The giant was vulnerable. All that was needed was a giant killer. It wasn't that David was a giant killer. It was that David's God was a giant killer. But when David trusted that God, when David took small steps, they became big leaps, and a giant fell to the floor. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this story. It's so familiar, but so encouraging too. And my guess is for people who are sitting in this auditorium or people watching at home that it's not that hard to identify a giant in their lives. I pray that you would encourage them this morning. Give them the courage to take the small step, whatever it is, so they can experience the giant leap, which is the giant toppling. Our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. If you don't have a relationship with God, I want to just challenge you with that to start with. To invite God into your story. We do that by trusting Jesus Christ. What he did when he came to earth, became a man, died on a cross for our sins, rose again, defeated sin, the grave, all of that, so that we could have this relationship with God. And if you've never taken that step, I'd encourage you to do that. If you have that relationship with God, he's on your side. He wants to help you. He knows about the giants in your story. He may just be waiting for you to take a small step. What is the step that you need to take? Will you commit to yourself this morning to take that step? And will you commit to God to take that step this week? God, I pray that you would give us courage to take small steps so that we can experience giant leaps and experience victories that you bring. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
The weapon may be formed, but it won't prosper. When the darkness falls, it won't prevail. 'Cause the God I serve knows only how to triumph. My God will never fail. My God will never fail. Oh, I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. There's power in the mighty name of Jesus. Every war he wages, he will win. Oh, I'm not backing down from any giant. I know how this story ends. Oh, I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. turn it for good. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good, and you turn it for good. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good, you turn it for good. I'm gonna see a victory, I'm gonna see a victory, for the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory, I'm gonna see a victory, for the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory, I'm gonna see a victory, for the battle belongs to you, Lord. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good, turn it for good. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good, turn it for good.
Just one last thing before we finish here this morning. A crate full of grateful is what we've decided to call this. These are out in the lobby. They're just mini crates. They're not very big. But we'd like to give these to all of the Grayson teachers this year for Thanksgiving, just to say, hey, thanks for what you're doing, for hanging in there in tough situations right now. You can pick them up. There's a card in there that gives you like 20 different ideas of things you could put in here. You're only going to be able to fit 3 or 4 or 5 things in here. It's not a very tough thing, but would you grab one of these, bring it back next Sunday? We're going to make sure that we give these to our Grayson teachers. Your small groups can take them. Your family can take one, whatever you want to do. But I encourage you to pick one of those up. And then also, just a reminder, it's Love Your Neighbor November. Let's be praying for our neighbors this week. Let's all stand together. Go through the exercise of putting our mask on, and you are dismissed. God bless you. Have a great day.
I'm gonna see a victory, I'm gonna see a victory, for the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory, I'm gonna see a victory.